I think the fear of China is very real, and one of the most sensitive subjects I'm going to discuss in my book, is a very sensitive subject, is that in the Western mind, in the subconscious, there's a fear of the yellow peril. Now that's, as you know, the yellow peril is a very sensitive subject, but it's real. So the Westerners have become frightened of China, but actually the Chinese, unlike the American, have no desire to try and go out and dominate the world, to try and create 13 aircraft carriers, to go and bomb countries. I mean, what is shocking? People are afraid that China is going to become warlike. But let me give you one statistic, okay? Since 1988, a small naval battle between China and Vietnam, China has not fired one bullet across its borders, not one. But in the last year of the Obama administration, and Obama was a very peaceful American president, the United States dropped 26,000 bombs on 7 countries. Why? Why drop 26,000 bombs? Now, we don't want a China that's dropping bombs. So the best way to make sure that China doesn't drop bombs, the West should stop dropping bombs first. Definitely, when I write my book on United States-China relations, I predict that relations between China and America, and to some extent relations between China and the West, will get worse in the next 10 years. Because since the West has got used to enjoying so much power, it has lost the art of sharing power. And now it's a question of sharing power with China. For example, you still had a case until recently where 3 small states in Europe, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, had a bigger voting share than China. But that's been changed. But clearly, as the Chinese economy becomes bigger, the voting share of China in the IMF must become bigger. And in fact, Christine Lagarde has said that under the rules of the IMF constitution, the IMF headquarters must be in the capital of the biggest economy in the world. Now, in nominal market terms, China is going to become the #1 economy in the world in nominal market terms. And so the Americans got to psychologically adjust to the International Monetary Fund moving from Washington, D.C. to Beijing. Now, that's something.
Would you support that? Do you think that this would be a good idea to move the IMF headquarters to Beijing?
Well, I think I would do it slowly, but if I was the Americans, I would start thinking about it now. The one thing that surprises me is that in my book, Has the West Lost It?, I say that one of the reasons why the rest of the world is doing so well is because the West has generously shared the gifts of Western civilization with the rest of the world, especially the gift of reasoning. Now, if you use reasoning, then you surely must understand that when power shifts, you have to make adjustments. But in America, it is impossible for any American politician to speak publicly about America becoming #2.
And
now,
you know this inside out because you have been the president of the UN Security Council as well. So you know what you're talking about when it comes to politics. How do you believe that China will reshape the global economic order in the next 50 years?
Well, as I said, China will shake the world gently, which means that China is quite ready to work with the established rules of the international order. That was the big message that President Xi Jinping conveyed in Switzerland. And for example, the Chinese actually want to strengthen the World Trade Organization, which is based in Switzerland, in Geneva. So what I would do, I would tell the West, unfortunately, President Donald Trump and his advisors are in some ways directly or indirectly trying to undermine the World Trade Organization. That's a mistake. Because you want to have a world in the future where you see China playing by the rules. Now, to have China playing by the rules, you must lead by example. So now is the time for the United States, as Bill Clinton said, to lead by example and to show that it supports multilateral rules. Because if the United States, as the world's #1 today, supports multilateral rules, when China comes along as the next #1, it will copy what America does. I fear that the West is about to lose it because the West refuses to make strategic adjustments to a completely different world. And it's very important to understand that we are entering a new era of world history.
And this is the Asian century. Do you think that the West is realizing this?
Well, I clearly the West is not realizing it. And just to give you one simple statistic, which I think everyone in the West should know, and that is that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. It's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and North America took off. But the past 200 years of world history have been a major historical aberration. Now, all aberrations come to a natural end, so it's perfectly natural to see the return of China and India and the rest of the Asia. And now it's time for Europe and America to adjust to this new reality. And they can happily adjust. That's my message.
They can happily adjust, but do you think that this is going to be smooth sailing, or do you expect more conflicts, especially when it comes to trade in the future?
Well, I suspect that even though I speak about the West in the book, it will be easier for Europe to adjust, because Europe has psychologically adjusted to the fact that it can no longer run the world. Now, the United States of America has not adjusted to the fact, psychologically, that it is going to become the number 2 power in the world, because America has been number 1 for, way over 100 years now. And so the Americans have become addicted to being number 1. And the thought that they may become number 2 is almost inconceivable to them, even though it's going to happen already in purchasing power parity terms. To just illustrate how much has changed, in 1980, the United States share of the global GNP in purchasing power parity terms was 10 times that of China. But then in 2014, China became bigger than the United States. And I find a very deep psychological resistance on the part of the Americans to even consider the possibility that they might become number 2.
So what is going to happen to their psychology?
Well, I think you will see a lot of resistance, and in many ways you have seen it clearly that China's rise has caused a lot of disquiet in America. And even though, as you know, President Donald Trump is a divisive, polarizing figure, everything he says, the Democrats says no. But when he attacks China, Democrats say, yes, we are with you. So he's getting by. The only issue on which Donald Trump gets bipartisan support in America is when he attacks or criticizes China. So it shows you that a consensus is building up in the American body politic to stand up to China. And I think in some ways this is natural, but it's actually better for the United States to be thoughtful and strategic about this. And I interviewed, for example, one-on-one. I had a one-on-one lunch with Dr. Henry Kissinger. He's the man who opened up China for America. And I think he also agrees that it's important for United States to take a long-term strategic view when dealing with China, because the Chinese, as you know better than I do, always take a long-term strategic view of these matters. The relations between US and China will get more and more difficult over the next 10 years, unless they read my next book.
And after 10 years, do you think they will improve?
That, I think after 10 years, it's too early to tell now. You can tell it will go down, and then it's a question of whether or not both sides have sufficient wisdom to learn to live with each other.
So these 10 years coming up, do you expect more trade wars, or do you think there could be US-China war and escalation of a conflict?
The good news is that there will be no military war between the United States and China, for one simple reason. If two nuclear powers like United States and China go to war with each other, you don't have a winner and a loser, you have two losers.
It will be the end of mankind.
So there's no question of United States and China going to have a military war, but there'll be proxy wars. And there'll be pressure on small states especially. So small states like Switzerland and Singapore should therefore work together to say, hey, you can have your quarrels with each other, but please don't use small states in your battle with each other. Don't use small states as proxies.
We have already seen, for example, Singapore's economy to slow down because of the US-China trade war. In the third quarter of this year, GDP has been slowing. Do you expect much further impact from the US-China trade war now?
But Overall, as you know, Singapore is still growing, has grown more than 3% in 2018. So that's a very good rate of growth for a country with a very high per capita GNP. Singapore, of course, is the most trade-dependent country in the whole world. Our total trade is 3.5 times the size of our GNP. 3.5 times. So clearly, we'll be affected if there's a trade war. And clearly we are against any kind of trade war. But we alone cannot stop it. So that's why it's important for our friends in Europe to work together with the Asian countries to preserve the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization is based in Switzerland. And therefore the world also expects Switzerland to play a leading role in defending the World Trade Organization.
To which extent do you think the future of the WTO is at stake?
I think the World Trade Organization is facing now the most dangerous moment ever in its history.
Do you think it will survive?
I hope that it will survive. I'm reasonably confident it will survive. But it will only survive if the other stakeholders, especially the European Union, Japan, India, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, all work together to protect the World Trade Organization, because multilateral institutions do not survive on their own. I was ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, so I know that you really have to continue to support them all the time if you want these multilateral institutions to survive and do well.
But given all the geopolitical tensions and differences between all of these blocs and countries, do you think they will be able to get their act together and work for the WTO and stand up for the organization?
I think there will be a rocky road. Things will go up, things will go down, things will go up, things will go down. But fortunately, you know, as I always say, and it's a document in my book, Has the West Lost It? The last 30 years of human history have been the best years of human history ever. We have made more progress in the last 30 years than the previous 3,000 years in terms of eliminating global poverty, increasing the global middle class population, and so on and so forth. So we have done an incredible amount, and that's a result of the WTO. As you know, the reason why China is doing so well is that in the last 30 years, China has built a world-class infrastructure. So if you want to see a third world airport, you go to the John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. You want to see a first world airport, you go and see the Beijing or Shanghai airport.
And the new Beijing airport is probably going to be the biggest in the world.
Exactly. And so now that China has accumulated a lot of expertise in building infrastructure, it is good for the world that China is now sharing that with the rest of the world. Now, clearly, China has made some mistakes. Okay? For example, in Sri Lanka, it may have been a mistake to build a port that is too big for Sri Lanka. But I think China can learn from its mistakes.
Also, the Belt and Road Initiative is triggering a big debt trap in poor nations, for example, in Africa. Do you think the Chinese are learning fast enough from these mistakes?
I'm a bit skeptical of that debt trap story, because I think we have to get the data before we make judgment on that. But certainly, I think it's important to understand that in the past, when you only had the World Bank to rely on, and you know, Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, tells a story that when Ethiopia once paid a loan to an American bank early, the American bank got angry and called the State Department, and the State Department told the World Bank to cut off loans to Ethiopia. So Ethiopia suffered. So the point is, it's good to have the World Bank, IMF, Chinese institutions all competing to provide development. That's good for the world. It's better for the world to have more choices. And so, for example, if the Chinese loan terms are too high, people can go to the World Bank. You have a choice now. And it's good for China to provide choices to the world. China will definitely shake the world. I mean, you know, we are in a small room, and if there's an elephant next to us lying down, and if the elephant wakes up, you will say, you know, the elephant is awake. But the good news I have is that China will shake the world gently. And the reason why China will shake the world gently is because the one thing the Chinese prize more than anything else, after 3,000 years of history, they prefer to have order and stability. Because the one thing that Chinese fear the most is chaos. You know Chinese, the Chinese word luan, fear of chaos. So the Chinese actually, amazingly enough, want to support multilateral institutions. And as you know, President Xi Jinping came to Switzerland in January 2017 and gave two brilliant speeches in Switzerland, one in Davos and one in Geneva. And if I was Switzerland, I would send the speeches by President Xi Jinping to every leader in the world to say this is how we should work with China. Long before anyone noticed, more than 25, 30 years ago, I began speaking about the return of Asia. And even 25 years ago, I was making very bold predictions that the 21st century is going to be the Asian century. Asia is coming back and you've got to deal with a new resurgent Asia. And so far, touch wood, all my predictions have come true. Well, I mean, one thing in common that Singapore shares with Switzerland is that, like Switzerland, we are also one of the most highly respected states in the world, because no country has improved the standard of living of its people as quickly and as comprehensively as Singapore has done in the last 53 years. It's a remarkable track record, and the whole world admires Singapore. And Singapore plays a leadership role in the United Nations because it is the chairman of the Forum of Small States at the UN. And in that capacity, we are always advising the big states that you must strengthen and respect multilateral institutions and strengthen the WTO, strengthen the United Nations, and that's the way forward.